cut your conversation short or anything, but I am cutting your conversation short a little bit. All right, we're going to pray. As we pray, I just chatting with a couple people. We've had some people, some pastors, suddenly pass here recently. We had Rhythm Church that lost a pastor. And I know the Father's House, the husband of the pastor there, suddenly passed. And so there's some parts of our body that are hurting right now and grieving. So I'd like to lift those churches up tonight. 'Cause many of us know what it's like to experience losing a pastor, and it's a tough thing. So we want to lift them up tonight as well as we get into the Word. Okay. Father, you're a good God. Thank you that you are present, always present. It's your name. It's who you are, Yahweh, the God who is. I thank you for your love for your body, that you will not leave the grieving and the hurting alone. You won't leave them where they are. You're there to comfort them, Lord. So I ask right now, God, would you be with Rhythm Church and Father's House, the families of those men that passed. So we don't understand why it seems like people go before their time. But we do understand that you are still God and that you're always there. So Lord, I lift them up before you. Wrap your arms around those families, God. Comfort them. And let their hope be in the resurrection, Lord, that one day we're all going to get those new bodies and be together again, spending eternity with you. Father, I ask you, be with us tonight as we get into your word, as we dive into a very unique story that I think myself included, just kind of ran through and for the longest time without really giving much thought. Lord, I thank you that every word in the Bible, regardless of if it's a weird name, whatever, it has a purpose. So Lord, help us understand, help us dive deeper and understand that aspect of your word, that everything has a purpose. You inspired these authors to write this word, and nothing is wasted. So Lord, let us enjoy and have fun as we learn about some very interesting concepts in your word that point to all point to a future that we all look forward to. Father, I ask you to take control tonight. I yield myself to you. I yield my faculties to you, Lord. Have your way in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Okay, so kind of following my general pattern. Now, what book are we in? Wow. Way too much thinking on that one. We're in Genesis. Yeah, we're in Genesis. I'll give it to you. It's only our third Wednesday. Maybe by the fifth or sixth one, everybody will know what book we're in by then, I hope. We're in Genesis. And so understanding when we're talking about books of the Bible, we understand that those books were written, right, by an author to a certain audience. And understanding that helps us understand how it applies to us. But we've got to understand that first. So little Bible pop quiz in here. So who is the book of Genesis attributed to? Like, who do they believe the author of the book of Genesis was? Moses. That's traditionally held that Moses is the author of Genesis. Jesus thought so. There's a lot of, we don't have a lot of hard, evidence that he wrote this book, but tradition pretty much across the board holds that he did. Now, do you believe he wrote it as we see it right now, like it's in our Bibles? We've never answered that question before. Probably not.
I can't think to some degree by the Spirit of God it is for all time.
Well, and this is something that though the Spirit of God can work through others too. That's something we have to keep in mind when it comes to the way the Bible came to us. There were editors and people that took these different texts and different oral traditions and edited and brought them together. Can the Spirit of God work through an editor? Well, for our sakes, the way we believe that God's word is, God breathed and inspired. Yeah, of course. And so it was very common. And when we see things in the way the Bible is put together, especially in the book of Genesis, we see it's pretty clear that there were editors, and we have pretty good standing that most of it, the way we read the Old Testament, especially the Torah, the first 5, were probably put together in the format that we read it, probably just either right at the end of the Babylonian exile or just after it. And we pick up on that because there's a frame to a lot of these stories, and we're going to see it today, for how Israel was to face Babylon, and that they would have victory over it. And that's a repeated theme in Genesis. So when we think about the audience of who this book was written to, and how we think of the editors and what they were shaping these stories, it was written. By this time, it was written to a group of Israelites that were just freshly out of exile, and they were dealing with this Babylonian, either in the middle of this Babylonian threat, or just fresh out of it, and probably a little shell shock. And so that's important to recognize as we get into the story tonight. Is that we're talking to people that have either just still dealing with or have just dealt with the weight of Babylonian rule over their lives. So chapter 12, chapter 13, quick review, okay? What happened? We're talking about really mainly focused on one dude here. Who is it? Abraham, right? So chapter 12, right? He gets called by God out of his home country, away from his family, right? Into this land that God would show him, right? And we see that, God promises him that he's going to, this land is going to be given to his offspring and all of this, right? And then immediately, right after God, he's told us, we shift the story a little bit and see him giving lying about, trying to say, telling his wife, because he's afraid that he's going to die because of how beautiful his wife is. Now, right off the bat, that should kind of show us a little issue there. God just said, I'm going to give this land to your offspring, right? Now he's worried he's going to die. Well, he's got to be alive to have offspring, right? So we already see that Abraham's struggling with trusting God, and we see this whole thing happen. Egypt, the Pharaoh takes in Sarai, and he doesn't actually sleep with her, but because God intervenes and begins to curse the people, threatens this curse upon the people of Egypt, and Pharaoh's like, why did you lie to me, and kind of thing. So we move forward, and they get a bunch of stuff, nice, lots of gold and livestock and all of this as Abraham goes back out of Egypt. So after they leave Egypt, we see that in chapter 13. What happens in chapter 13? We did that. This is the one we did last time. Do what? Yeah, we see, the division of Abraham's traveling company, right? We see Lot, his nephew, and there's all these possessions, and we see this division happen. It seems to happen pretty cordially between the two of them, but it is kind of a sign that something's going wrong here, and I won't get into all that. A couple of you guys that are in my life group, you kind of a little ahead of the game on this a little bit, but as the Bible shows different patterns, we're supposed to look at that scenario in a way of like, okay, yeah, they ended on good terms, but man, people split, brothers splitting, because I'll say brothers, even though he was his nephew. There's a little something to that. It's the idea of a family splitting up, and we should be kind of bummed. Like, maybe they could have made it work. Could they have not spread out a little bit more? Did they have to go two different ways? And we see Lot choose the land based on how it looked, right? It looked good, but we also are given that hint that it's close to Sodom and Gomorrah, which is going to be destroyed. We don't know that yet. We only know that because the little narrator jumps in and says, by the way, this is before Sodom and Gomorrah is going to be destroyed, right? They give us a little foreshadowing, like something's about to happen. And Lot's choice is about to bite him in the behind. And that is where we get left off. Abraham gets blessed again and hangs out by some trees. There's a cool little thing there I'm not going to get into, a little rabbit trail. And that is when we step into chapter 14. Now, chapter 14 is kind of unique, and Genesis has a few of these kinds of chapters that seem to interrupt the story, and they just seem kind of out of place. One of the other chapters is, later on is the chapter about Judah and Tamar, the very disturbing story, but it seems to just kind of interrupt. And to us, the way we think of stories, we think very linearly, how one plot line should go into the next and carry up to the climax, and then we have a certain idea of how stories go. But the authors here and the editors have something else in mind when they're putting these stories together. They're trying to paint a picture, and most people, when we get to chapter 14, they get excited at the end of the chapter because Melchizedek, so cool. But we kind of tend to run through the first part. But I'm going to show you there's some really cool stuff in that, why we have all these weird names. And there's a reason I didn't have anybody else have a mic tonight, because as much as I would love to, we'd all love to laugh at you. And when you try to pronounce these names, I'm going to save you a little bit from that, because some of these names are really weird, and I had to practice a little bit. I'm going to have some trouble with them myself tonight. So we're going to jump in here. Okay, chapter 14, we're going to do the first 4 verses. Here we go. And it happened that in the days of Amraphel, the king of Shinar, Arioch, the king of Elazar, Chedor Laomer, the king of Elam, Tidal, the king of Goyim, made war with Bera, the king of Sodom, and Birsha, the king of Gomorrah, Shinab, the king of Admah, and Shemeber, the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar. All these joined forces at the valley of Sidim, that is the Sea of the Salt. 12 years they had served Chedorlaomer, but in the 13th year they rebelled. Woo! Riveting, right? Riveting information. How many of you guys have ever read this passage and you just kind of glanced, you started seeing names like that, and you went, okay, I'm just gonna fast forward. I did that as well. But when getting to know how Jewish writers write narratives, which is what this part of the Bible is a narrative, it's telling a story, is that everything, when you start seeing names like this, you might take some time to go study out what these names mean, because many times when you see a list of names like this, the author's trying to drive home a certain idea. So I have right under here, we're going to walk through these, I've copied this passage, and in red here, I have some either translations of these names or some details related to. And we're going to look at a little bit of a pattern because there is a lot of what we call wordplay in this passage. And it's when the Jewish writers were playing around with names and words to try to create this scene for their reader. As they were going over this. So if we get to Amraphel, the sayer of darkness. Sayer's like a medium or so right off the bat, okay, this guy's not good. But who's the king of? Shinar. Well, any good my biblical scholars out here remember the name the Shinar? Shows up earlier in the Bible. It's a plain that's described, a field, where they build a city that happens to have a really big tower that reaches up. Tower of Babylon. That's the field of Shinar. So in your notes there, I have Babylon. This is a part of Babylon that this king is from. Arioch, he's lion-like. Okay. Again, we're painting this picture of this bad dude here. Okay, he's the king of Eleazar. Well, Eleazar is a province of Babylon. Picking up on a pattern yet? Chedor Leomer, the servant of Lagomar. Lagomar means no mercy. It was a deity of the in that time that its name meant no mercy. So far we've got a band of dudes here, right? We have Sayer of Darkness, we've got this lion-like guy, we've got the servant of no mercy, the king of Elam. Well, Elam is just east of Babylon, getting further east into, all the bad stuff comes from the east, okay, in biblical narratives, okay? Tidal means the great sun. Okay, the king of Goyim, which is the nations. So that guy, he doesn't sound too bad. But it's in the Jewish sense, they're thinking this guy's, when you get that name, like great son, it's like he's being exalted. He's the great son of the nations. Well, the nations, the Goyim was not a good term. Goyim was a term for Gentiles generally, or non-Jews later on in the Jewish. So these are the guys. These are the non-God followers. Okay, he's this great son of the nation of those nations. You can almost put it that way. So we have the really bad making war with the pretty bad too. So they made war with Bera. His name means son of evil. He's the king of Sodom, which means burning. That's funny. Sodom, burning. We'll get there. And Birsha, which means with iniquity. The king of Gomorrah, which means submersion, which I think is kind of interesting. You've got burning, usually the twin cities, Sodom and Gomorrah. You've got burning, and you've got submersion. Both the idea of burning, obviously, I think we can pull that one together. The idea of submersion, though, of going down, is also a depiction of darkness, of separation from good. Okay, so we got Shenob, hater of the father, the king of dirt. Adma is a form of we have where we get the word Adam, which means earth. He's the king of dirt, where human beings were created from, but it's this idea of lowliness. And as we get further in, we've got Shemeber, soaring on high, who's the king of goats. Now, that's a whole other rabbit trail I'm not going to get into, but just throw the goats in the sense of divine beings, in the sense, the way the Jews looked at it. If anybody has studied out Azazel, a little bit of Jewish tradition, it was a demon that some of the Canaanites worshipped that was a goat demon, similar to what we may see today and like what the Satanists use as symbolism for, their beliefs. It's a goat. And that has got a long, deep tradition in Canaanite worship. So goats, in this sense, that's what we're thinking. Okay, think Satan goat. Okay, that's what the author's thinking when he's piecing these kings together. And then we got Bela, which is kind of funny, the king of destruction. That is Zoar, which means insignificance. This is the only king they don't actually name. Isn't it kind of funny? He comes from Zoar, insignificant. They don't even name him. Zoar, remember that. Remember that for the next chapter when we get to, actually not the next chapter. It'll be a few chapters later when Lot escapes Sodom and Gomorrah the second time, because he goes to a little place called Zoar. So we have all these weird names and all these, all this setup. What we're seeing is we have this battle, right? It's like World War .5, okay, of these really bad guys fighting these really bad guys. Now, what's important here is the word king here this is the first time in the Bible that the word king is used. Check it out. First time. So we're starting and that's important. The rule of first mention in understanding Bible words tells us that the first time something's mentioned in the Bible, to understand its meaning and its background, it should affect how we think of every time it's used throughout the rest of the scriptures. So we're already starting off the idea of kings here as not being it's not the best thing, okay? And you can, if you know your Bible and you know the whole thing with Samuel and Israel wanting a king and all of this, all that, the anger that God has, what's the big deal if you have a king? Well, we're already starting off with kings, and it's not really that great of a setup. So one more question for you to pull on this, and we're going to pin this right here. Where did Abram come from? What was his? It's actually and if you get there quick enough, it's the end of chapter 11. We didn't touch on it, but let's see if anybody remembers it. Ur of the Chaldeans. Yeah. Guess what that is? Guess where that is? Babylon. Chaldeans was a province of Babylon. Abram came from Babylon. Pin that right there. That's going to be important for our story. Okay? So we're going to keep going. More fun names here for you. This one will be quicker. So in the 14th year of Chedorlaomer, and the kings who were with him came and defeated the Rephaim in Ashtaroth Karaim, and the Zuzim in Ham, and the Himin in Shavah Kirathaim, and the Horites in the hill country of Seir, as far as El Paran, which is at the wilderness. Okay, so big deal. But this is a big deal. So I have a couple little notes there at the bottom that help you out a little bit. So we have, the first 5 kings that are mentioned in verse 1, actually. Those kings come and the author's jumping in going, hey, the first 5, they're getting to make war with these other guys. But before that, let me tell you a little bit more about this Chedorlaomer guy, okay? This guy, well, he came and he beat some even worse dudes than he's fighting now, okay? So that's where we're at right now in the story. Like we're getting think of it kind of like a little aside of, let me tell you a little bit more give you a little background to this guy that's waging this war. He defeated the Rephaim. Now, the Rephaim were, as we find later on in the Bible, were part of where they were giants. They were Nephilim, which are the or Hibarim is where it's used a lot of time in Genesis chapter 6. These guys were warriors, and they were giants. Think Goliath, Og, Sihon, or those are a few of the giants that are mentioned in the Bible by name. But so these guys were bad dudes. Okay, these weren't just normal, your everyday average, Canaanite. These were giants that Kedorlaomer and the other kings that were with him, they beat these guys. They also beat the Zuzim. Now, Zuzim means roving creatures. So we're getting this idea of okay, we had really bad guys, pretty bad guys. Now we're getting monsters. Okay. This is supposed to paint the picture in our head of this is like a comic book almost. So we would think of the villains versus the super villains versus those guys. It's a really crazy picture. Because then we have the Emin, which means terrors. And then the Horites, which were cave dwellers. Tradition goes back to some of you guys have ever heard the term troglodytes. They were in tradition and mythology, they were these guys that were hill dwarfs, kind of people. They were hill people. And so these guys are nasty dudes. But what we see is that Kedorlaomer and all his friends, they came in and beat them all. I have just to touch on the next page in Deuteronomy 2, 10 and 11 talks about the Emim and the Rephaim a little bit and gives us a little context to who these guys are. So it says the Emim previously lived. This isn't as important to our story, but I don't like to just throw scripture in there without telling you where it's from. But Deuteronomy 2, Moses is talking about the people that lived in the wilderness around Israel as they were walking through the wilderness area. So that's where this verse comes from. But he talks about the Emim, which we see mentioned here in Genesis 5. And he describes them as people large, numerous, tall, like the Anakites. Those people are going to come back soon too. And then they were reckoned also as the Rephaim. So they looked at them as, they were like the Rephaim. They were giants, right? As the Anakites were. And then they said, but the Moabites called them Emim. So what he's saying all is these are all, these are giant dudes. They're all connected. They're all from that same group of people, okay? Now that little Deuteronomy 2 verses there, though, that's going to help us a little bit later on. So we will come back to that. So moving into the rest of our story here, verse 7, we're still talking about what, Kedorlaomer did. We're still talking about his story, all right? So his group and his friends, it says, then they turned back and came to En Mishpat, that is Kadesh. Now, when you're reading the book of Genesis and you see that is Kadesh, and it says, it gives you a different name, you want to pay attention to that. That's like the narrator kind of jumping in and going, hey, this actually means this. The reason they're telling you that is because there's a point where that's going to connect later on down in the Torah. Maybe not in Genesis. And what we'll see is that there's a lot of, later books in the Torah that give us some understanding of what's going on here. But little note as you're studying the Bible, when you see those little things jump out, pay attention. You might even go back and say, okay, Kadesh. Where does the Bible talk about Kadesh? We'll get there. But little Bible study tip there for you. And they defeated the whole territory of the Amalekites. Well, that's going to come into play later. And also the Amorites, who were living in Hazazon Tamar. Amorites, that's going to come into play later too. Remember that. Then the king of Sodom, the king of Gomorrah, the king of Admah, the king of Zeboim, the king of Bela, that is Zoar, just reminding you they're insignificant. They went out and they took up battle position. Okay, so now the narrators like to do this. All of a sudden, now we've jumped back into present time. Okay, we had this little side talking about Leomir. Now we're back at the war. Okay, so the second set of bad guys is now they're getting ready to take up battle. Okay, they're in the valley of Siddim. Okay, so they went out and took up battle position in the valley of Siddim with Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of Goyim, and Amraphel, king of Shinar, and Arioch, king of Elazar, 4 kings against 5. Aren't you guys glad I didn't have you read this? I'm feeling like I need water after drinking this. After saying this, I feel like I need to drink. Now the valley of Siddim was full of tar pits. And the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled and fell into them. But the rest fled to the mountains. So they, talking about Chedorlaomer's crew here, they took all the possessions of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their provisions, and they left. And they took Lot, the son of the brother of Abram, and his possessions, and left. Now, side note, now he had been living in Sodom. The author's trying to just remember. He was living in Sodom. So, a couple things in this one. It said, remember Kadesh. Pin that there. We have a little bit of narrative detail here that the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah falling into tar pits. Now that little phrase was actually supposed to make you giggle a little bit, okay? Because you've already been told, like, okay, Sodom and Gomorrah is going to get destroyed. You don't know exactly how, the details yet, but they're going to get destroyed. But now it's kind of insult to injury here. Because they're saying, Sodom and Gomorrah, the kings ran, all the rest of them made it to the mountains, but they fell in the pits. Well, the idea of falling into a pit is some imagery that we actually see picked up in other parts of the Old Testament of judgment, utter judgment, being driven into the pit. Where did Joseph get thrown? He was thrown in the pit. It's this picture of the evil of his brothers throwing him into the pit is the idea of being completely separated, okay, from family, from life. It's death. It's a representation of death, right? They left Joseph there to die, right? Except, we'll throw him, hopefully you'll get taken into slavery. But in the essence, to the Jew, to the Jewish thought, it was no different than to be taken into slavery, to have your purpose taken away, or to die. There was no difference. Joseph was there to die. So that imagery we see picked up later on is brought out right here. Sodom and Gomorrah. It's a little pre-show here. They're gonna be destroyed. Now Lot probably is regretting his choice at this point. Right, so here's our first little instance. We saw that Lot, we kind of got some hints in chapter 12 that things aren't going to go right. Well, here Lot just got in the middle of World War .5 here, and he becomes a prisoner to this. He experienced his own little exile very early on, right off the bat. And, he had been living in Sodom. Wasn't a good idea from the get-go. Right? So here we go. We see him taken. So let's go one step further, verse 13. Then one who escaped came and told Abram the Hebrew. And he was living at the oaks of Mamre, the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and brother of Aner. They were allies with Abram. Okay? So, a couple details here that seem like, so what? First time the Bible mentions the word Hebrew, right here. First time it's used. There's a picture. The idea, the name, the word Hebrew, it's got a double meaning. That I believe that the author's actually hitting both of these in this story. But the one meaning is it means wanderer or nomad. Okay, so you had all of these kings talked about, and now all of a sudden here's Abram, the nomad, the wanderer. He doesn't have a city. He travels all around, right? He's just moving wherever, pitching a tent and moving forward. He's got a lot of money, a lot of possessions, but he doesn't have a city like the rest of them. So it's pointing out here is distinguishing Abram from the other guys, the other kings of these cities. You have Abram the wanderer. But the other way Hebrew is used, the word Hebrew is used, is it can is the idea of one who is from beyond. So the best analogy is think of our word alien. Right? We use it in two different ways, right? You have a person who's coming from another country that is in, wandering or going through another country is an alien, right? But then you have aliens from outer space, right? From beyond. Think of a similar situation here with the word Hebrew. And it's the idea of Abram being not necessarily from this world, so to speak. That's going to be important to our story. Okay? Now, there's a little note here. We mentioned a couple of guys. We mentioned Eshcol and Aner. Now, anybody in my Bible scholars in here, Eshcol, does that ring a bell to anybody? Grapes, clusters. Yeah, where do we see that? We have a story about that, right? About something about Eshcol, okay, what became the Valley of Eshcol. And I have that actually in your next passage, Numbers 13, 23 through 28. So this is where the Bible becomes what we call meditation literature, because you'll have little names that pop up that are meant to make you go, wait, I've read this somewhere before. And it's meant to make you go to that place and see what's the context? Why have I read that? And to help, you'll start to see connections between stories in that way in the Bible is when you see those kinds of words repeated. So, and what we find is actually this little story gives us a few more words than just Eshcol that are going to connect to our story that we've read so far. So, context of Numbers 13, this is the the story of the 12 spies. Israel, they've gone through the wilderness. They are ready to go into the promised land. They send spies into the promised land for 40 days to look over the land, right? And so this is where we're at right now in the story. They've sent the spies. We're going to talk a little bit about what the spies see, and then the spies are going to come back, okay? So that's where our context is right now. So starting at Numbers 23, we'll read this real quickly. And they came up to the valley of Eshcol, and they cut off a vine branch and one cluster of grapes from there. And they carried it on a pole between two men with pomegranates and figs. That place he called the valley of Eshcol on account of the cluster of grapes that the Israelites cut off from there. They returned from exploring the land at the end of 40 days, and they came to Moses and Aaron, to the entire community of the Israelites in the desert of Paran at Kadesh. Remember Kadesh? And you actually already read Paran too. Paran is in where did I have it here? Verse 6. Yeah. So just a little note there, if you want to keep that in mind, right there we see a El Paran. It's the same concept. Okay, same word. All right, just different spelling, but it's the same word. They brought back word to them and to all the community, and they showed them the fruit of the land. And they told him, talking to Moses, we came to the land that you sent us, and it's flowing of milk and honey. This is its fruit. Yet the people who are inhabiting it are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large. Moreover, we saw the descendants of the Anakites there. Now, I told you Deuteronomy 2 was going to help us out a little bit. I had Deuteronomy 2, 10 through 11. What were the Rephaim reckoned as? It says they were also reckoned, the Emim as well, were reckoned as the Anakites, right? Dots, connecting dots. We have Anakites to Rephaim. Rephaim, well, those were some of the really bad dudes that Chedor Laomer, beat up, all right? So the author's drawing some connections here to this little story of the spies in Numbers. But we're going to see a bigger story here come out because, well, let me hear from you guys. What happened with the spies? How many of you guys know your Bible, know your Numbers there? Or at least your children's Bible stories. I think this one gets in there sometimes too. What happened? When they sent the spies came back. We got part of the story. 10 of them, right? 10 of them were fearful, and they told the Israelites, those guys, the Amalekites are there, and there's giants in the land, and they'll just, they literally say the ground will swallow them up, and they will swallow us up. And we were like grasshoppers in their eyes, right? It says they put fear into the hearts of the Israelites. And then you had the two other spies. Anybody remember their names? Caleb and Joshua. That were like, guys, Israel, don't listen to them. We can take this land. We've got this. God will give this land to us. It's going to be all right. They didn't listen, right? And so what happens to Israel when they believe the bad report? Exactly. What would have taken just a couple weeks, they spent 40 years in the wilderness for believing and listening. I mean, I say believing, the 10 spies weren't lying. They were big dudes in there. But the Israelites, they believed and feared for their lives. They didn't believe the promise that God gave them. Well, let's see what happens with Abram. Next part here, verse 14. When Abram heard that his relative was taken captive, he summoned his trained men born in his house, 318 of them, and he went in pursuit up to Dan. And he divided his trained men against them at night, he and his servants, and he defeated them and pursued them to Hobah, which is north of Damascus. It's about 15 miles, how far he pursued them. And he brought back all the possessions, and he also brought back Lot, his relative, and his possessions, and the women and the people as well. So here we have Abram coming in, the Hebrew, the wanderer, comes in and defeats Chedor Laomer and his buddies. Now we found out that Chedor Laomer, they were giant killers. Okay, these guys were no pushovers. These guys cleared out the land of all these giants, right? Abram and his crew, they were giant killers. Okay, so there's a reason for these. We're bringing an idea of like we have this wanderer, this no-name guy, right? He's got money, but he's just wandering. He doesn't have a city. He's facing these kings and their armies with 318 other wanderers, and he lays out the toughest of the tough. Now, right there, you're supposed to see a distinction happening and between how Abram handled these guys and how Israel, what Israel was acting in the face of these giants, right? Abram killed the guys that killed the giants. Israel couldn't even face the giants and couldn't. And so you're seeing Abram did something that Israel couldn't. And I actually have a personal testimony with this story. Because when I was, my wife was pregnant with Leo, I was really dealing with just feeling, just completely, I'm their father, feels completely unprepared. And even for me, I didn't really have a good father figure growing up. And when you think of the King family, the men, most of them, you could draw the lines to alcoholics and womanizers, pretty far back. And so I felt really, I didn't want my son. I didn't want my son to follow that line. I was trying to bring a new something new to our family. That our family, take our family a different direction. I didn't want the King name to be under that weight, that shadow anymore. And I was actually reading through Genesis, and I got to that part about Abram being a giant killer. And I kind of stopped as I started reading these names, started studying out these guys, and I'm like, wow, okay. Something jumped out at me, like something Joshua and Caleb, being a giant killer was in their heritage. Their forefathers were giant killers. And Israel, somewhere in the 400 years of slavery, and they lost their legacy. They lost the vision of their legacy, what they came from. And you see it happen with the spies, right? And so, but something Joshua and Caleb, I feel like they tapped into something in their legacy that said, we can take these guys, right? They never brought up Abram, but there was something that said, we've been here before. We can take this. We can take them. And when that jumped out at me, I didn't know at the moment why that was so important, but a couple days later, I got on Facebook, and I've got a cousin who does all the, tracing family lines back, and she has a whole Facebook page that's what she does for fun, and it's her hobby, and I couldn't spend as much time, but she comes up with really cool stuff of like tracing our family back in like all these different clans, and I happened to jump on there, and I saw this picture of this coat of arms for this Irish clan that she traced the King family back to, and I started reading this article, and it was talking about we were tracing their family back to this Irish clan that was a very honorable clan, and they were strong, and they got their name got run into the dirt, and they were falsely accused and persecuted, and got their whole what's the term? What's the word I'm looking for? Like, how everyone viewed them was completely changed because of a false accusation of one of the clan members. And it wasn't till it was hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years later that they had their name was restored, and there were reparation made because of the hundreds of centuries of just being slung through the mud. And so I saw that there was this parallel of my family had been through this. As far as I could see back, we were alcoholics and womanizers all the way back. But I see this clan that was actually really honorable people at one point, and they really were. And then something happened, and for hundreds of years they were slung. I started to see some parallels coming through. And that God wasn't really changing where my legacy was going. He was bringing back what it was meant to be, what it was from the get-go, restoring what the legacy was in my family line. And then I saw the coat of arms, and the coat of arms was a lion with a crown. Well, my son's name is Leo, and that came out in prayer. I don't know why. It's just what I felt the Lord laid on my heart was Leo, and it was Latin for lion. King, I think we can all figure that out. That's my last name. Anthony is to be praised. And I saw this lion with a crown, and all of a sudden I just knew that God's restoring the legacy of my family. And that's what we see. That's what God's heart was for Israel. It's for them to see that this is where you came from. But they let what was in front of them. They didn't remember. They didn't remember Abraham, and that he had defeated the ones that had defeated those guys. They just saw what was in front of them, and it's like, we can never. They'll kill us. They'll destroy us. we have a greater legacy because we have a greater God. And that's where we see happening here with Abram. So, little cool note, when he says he summoned his trained men. That summon is like drawing a sword. It's used for draw in other parts of the Bible. So it's a picture of God's judgment. He's going to be the hand of God's judgment against these giants. Little play on words there, but I'll give that one to you for free. Now that's usually where most people get to this part and everybody gets really excited. But this is gonna tie our picture together. Verse 17. After his return from defeating Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet him at the valley Shaveh, that is the valley of the king. And Melchizedek, the king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was the priest of God Most High. And he blessed him and said, "Blessed be Abram by God Most High, maker of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand." And Abram gave Melchizedek a tenth of everything. Now, here's what, I keep saying here's this, because we're painting a picture here. Where did Abram come from? That was one of the first questions I asked you. Came from Babylon. Who did he defeat in battle? Very first page, where did all these kings, this first set of kings come from? The first set, Amraphel, Arioch, Chedorlaomer, where'd they come from? Babylon. So, we have a guy who was called out of Babylon. And in a way, Babylon comes back after him. He defeats Babylon. And when he defeats Babylon, here he comes with this very interesting character, Melchizedek, Canaanite priest of the God Most High, which is kind of a neat little, I won't get into Melchizedek too much tonight, because we won't leave anytime soon. But if wherever you believe who Melchizedek was, this would be a non-chosen people, follower of God. He wasn't in the Abraham line. He was a Canaanite. But it says he worshiped the God Most High. We see him blessing him, and they had a feast. Bread and wine is a euphemism for a feast. So a wanderer from beyond leaves Babylon. Babylon comes after him, right? He comes in to restore his family, defeats Babylon, and then meets this figure, this priestly king, and they have a feast to celebrate their victory. Does that storyline ring a bell with anybody? Think big picture. Called out of the Babylonian system of the world. Chosen people, right? With their chosen one, Abraham, the head. Think of, this is where we get into messianic literature. You see these types and these people that are like supposed to be like this is the true image of God kind of person with his people, right? Trained in his house, defeating Babylon, the world system, and then afterwards having a big feast and experiencing blessing. You following me yet? Whose story is that? It's the church. It's our story. It's the story that John is riffing on in the book of Revelation when Babylon is torn down, and the Messiah, the Christ, comes and takes out the system, right? And what do we sell? We celebrate with a feast. This is a picture that will be repeated throughout the Bible, very early on in the book of Genesis. But we see our picture, our story here. And Abram, in how he's placed here, is he how he's shown us to be like the king, is like a king in a priestly role, because his giving, his blessing from this priestly king, and then the giving of the tenth, the offering. This is priestly language. It's that kingdom of priest picture here. Who's also the kingdom? Who's called a kingdom of priest first? What people group is called a kingdom of priests? Thought I heard it. Anybody? First time it's mentioned? Exodus. Israel. Israel's called a kingdom of priests, right? Right after. If you didn't know that, now you do. Woo, kingdom of priests. Okay, but then who else is called a kingdom of priests later on in the Bible? By Peter. The church, right? Kingdom of this whole idea of priestly king, this king priest thing. It's a picture that we see starting out even, actually back in Genesis 2. Don't have time for that, but we're seeing, again, this language is probably this idea of the people of God functioning as priest kings, okay, coming together. This is are you guys seeing the pattern, or am I going crazy here? I know I'm not going crazy, but are we seeing the patterns here? This is how we do meditative, reading of the Bible, as we see these little patterns come up. So let's read this last portion. We're going to pull it all together. And the king of Sodom said to Abram, "Give me the people, but the possessions take for yourself." Now, right now, we have a big distinction between how Melchizedek approached Abram and how the king of Sodom approached Abram. Because if we see, Melchizedek kind of interrupts the story, because verse 17, we're saying this. We see the king of Sodom coming out to meet Abram. But then, hold on. There was this guy from Melchizedek, right? We had to talk about him first. And then we get back down. Okay, now we'll tell you what Sodom, the king of Sodom, had to say. Maybe he's wiping off the tar off of his, the tar off his cloak at this point. And Abram said to the king of Sodom, "I have raised my hand to Yahweh, God Most High, maker of heaven and earth." Okay, we've heard that language recently, right? That's what Melchizedek said. "And that neither a thread nor a thong of a sandal would I take from all that belongs to you, that you might not say, I made Abram rich. Nothing besides what the servants have eaten and the share of men who went out from me will I take. Let Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre take their share." So we see Abram giving a tenth of everything that he has and having a feast with this crazy Melchizedek dude that worships God. And then we see this language from Abram where he said, "I have raised my hand to Yahweh." Now, we don't ever hear him, make this kind of oath before God that he wouldn't take anything from Sodom. But if we look at the language, it sounds kind of like there was some covenant language that was used here between Melchizedek and Abram. And he makes a point to recognize first that Melchizedek and he worshiped the same God, which that would be really weird to a Jewish reader, because this guy, Melchizedek, is not a Jew. He's not from the chosen line. So Abram is validating Melchizedek in this statement. And he's recognizing that we worship the same God. And that's important, because God Most High, the Most High, El Elyon, was actually another God that was worshipped during that time. So there's a little clarification here. He is worshiping the same God that I serve. And you know what? I'm not going to give you guys any credit for what God's blessed me with. This is actually Garden of Eden language. This is like this king of Sodom he's the snake in this story, in this end of this story, offering this fruit to eat from because it looks good and you can have this, right? And he's like, no, I won't take, you won't get any credit for what God's blessing in my life. Abram chooses, again, he does what Adam and Eve didn't do, is he chose to not eat the fruit, to not take from Sodom. So this priestly king dude, that's wanderer from beyond, right? Coming out of Babylon. Babylon comes after him. He defeats them, has a feast, and gets the opportunity to make another really bad choice, but chooses not to. This is where where we begin to see ourselves in the scriptures, because not only big picture, right? We are going to have the victory feast, right, with Jesus, but anytime we experience victory, have that chance to fall again. And it was probably pretty, I don't know how much Sodom had left after everything was taken from, he just got everything back that the Kedorlaomer and all their friends had taken from Sodom and Gomorrah, right? They got raided. Now he brought everything back. And Sodom's like, hey, take the possessions for yourself. It's probably a lot. But Abram refused. He gave credit to God. Victories put us in place. Where do you see most, I think of ministers that experience a lot of success. And it's at their peak of success when get greedy, or we get, we become the idea that we're invincible. And that's when those choices come, and many people take of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil at that point. Abram didn't this time. Unfortunately, it doesn't stay that way, which is supposed to show us that Abram's not the one. He's not the Messiah. He's not the one that's going to bring humanity back from their brink of their self-destruction. There's got to be a better one coming. We know that better one now, don't we? Did you guys enjoy this, I hope? I pulled a lot of things together with this is how the Bible works. Especially with weird stories like this. Hopefully you got to see how a weird story like this, when you get, works in the Bible. So when you get to other like weird chapters and Numbers, there's some ones in there, lots of them in Numbers and Deuteronomy. Stop and go back and look at some names. Go cross-reference. You might come across a really cool story, because the Bible's full of them. Thank you, guys. I appreciate you. Be blessed, and have a good night. Bless you.